Welcome to my channel. I wish you a pleasant listening experience. Graham sat in his kitchen, soaking up the rare pleasure of a peaceful day off. He'd planned it all out in his mind. Time to unwind, maybe fire up the grill, and just enjoy the day with his wife, Sharon. She was out at her yoga class, a hobby that had become a near-daily ritual. Graham didn't mind, though. If it helped Sharon feel good, that was all he needed to know. Today, he thought, could be special. He pictured them relaxing in the backyard with cold drinks, steaks sizzling on the barbecue, maybe a playlist of their favorite tunes setting the mood for the afternoon. He felt genuinely happy, content. It was a feeling he rarely got with his demanding job and the usual everyday worries. As he mulled over what sides would go best with the barbecue, Graham noticed a car pulling up to the house. Perfect timing, he muttered, already imagining her walking in, all smiles, ready to share the day with him. But as Sharon stepped out of the car, he saw that she wasn't alone. A young man, maybe in his mid-20s, climbed out of the passenger seat and followed Sharon up the walkway. Graham's contentment was quickly clouded by a pang of confusion. He tried to shake it off, figuring Sharon had probably given some friend from her class a ride home. When Sharon opened the door, her eyes met his, and she hesitated. She greeted him warmly, but with a strange undertone, then gestured to the young man at her side. "This is Stanley," she said, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "We met at yoga. He's my partner." The word lingered in the air like an unfinished sentence. Graham stood up, extending a polite hand to Stanley, but something about the young man's nonchalant demeanor seemed out of place. Graham was just about to ask Sharon more when she motioned for them all to sit down. "I think we should talk," Sharon said, her voice calm, as if what she was about to say was the most natural thing in the world. Graham's confusion intensified as she began explaining how Stanley wasn't just a yoga buddy. According to Sharon, they shared a spiritual connection that went beyond friendship, something that apparently needed to be maintained physically. Graham's head spun with every word she uttered, and he finally interrupted, unable to stand the vague language any longer. "Sharon," he said, his voice tense, "just tell me directly. What exactly are you saying?" Sharon's expression didn't falter. "Stanley is my lover, Graham, but it's not what you think. It's not serious. He's just someone I connect with, someone I can enjoy." She placed a reassuring hand on Graham's, as if she expected him to simply understand and accept it all. "You're my number one," she added with an odd, almost condescending smile. "This is just a part of who I am now, and I need you to accept it." The shock hit Graham like a tidal wave. He felt his stomach churn, anger bubbling beneath the surface, but he kept himself composed. He needed to understand, needed to grasp what had led his wife here to this moment, sitting across from him with a lover by her side. Graham sat back, his face expressionless, as he looked between Sharon and Stanley. His self-control was legendary among friends and family. Years of practicing stoicism had taught him to master his emotions, to keep them under lock and key. And yet, nothing could have prepared him for this. Still, he told himself, "Wait, listen to everything. Don't react yet." So he began. His voice steady but low. "You're telling me Stanley is your lover? And this is? For spiritual development?" Sharon nodded, her face calm, almost serene. "Yes, that's right, Graham. This is part of a journey I'm on. Something deeper than just the physical. Stanley is helping me grow spiritually through a tantric practice that's transformative." She clasped her hands in front of her, as though she were explaining a topic in a classroom, rather than delivering a bombshell to her husband. Before Graham could respond, Stanley chimed in, his voice soft but practiced. "Tantra and spiritual connection. Graham, sometimes need physical contact," he said, his eyes earnest. "The body is a vessel, and through certain practices, we're able to unlock a different kind of energy. It's a form of meditation." Graham could feel anger roiling inside him, barely held in check. He took a deep breath, willing himself to stay calm. "This is absurd," he thought, "but I'll let them talk." "So, you say you're helping Sharon with her energy, huh?" he asked, his tone calm but unmistakably laced with sarcasm. "And what about me? I'm just supposed to accept that my wife has physical intimacy with someone else, for the sake of spiritual progress. Graham, Sharon replied patiently, I'm being honest with you. That's why I brought Stanley here to meet you. I wanted to explain it openly. I don't want deception in our marriage, so I'm telling you the truth. Yes, Stanley and I share physical intimacy, and I need to continue this for my development, for the growth of my feminine energy. Stanley nodded in agreement, as if they were both following a well-rehearsed script. Graham held back a scoff. So, by your logic, if I found a woman, brought her home, and told you I needed her for some spiritual growth, that would be fine? Sharon's face fell. Graham, that's different. That would be cheating. If you brought a woman home, it would obviously be just for sex, or maybe to get back at me. But Stanley and I aren't doing this out of lust or revenge. We're on a different path. This is for growth, for a ridiculousness of her explanation. So what? Stanley will be spending the night here in our bedroom. He asked, half joking, half deadly serious. You're twisting everything, Sharon replied, her tone faintly exasperated. If I wanted to cheat, I'd just do it in secret and never tell you. I'm telling you the truth because I want us to be honest with each other. Graham let out a slow breath, the anger barely contained behind his stoic mask. All right, he said, his voice steady. Then how long has this spiritual practice been going on? We just started, which is why I'm telling you now. She looked at him intently, as if expecting praise for her honesty. So everything can be open between us. Graham's lips twisted in a bitter smile. So, just to be clear, I'm supposed to share my wife with another man? Because it's spiritual? He shook his head in disbelief. Sharon, do you realize how insane this sounds? Graham, please, she replied, her voice softening. You are my favorite husband, my number one. I'm just asking you to accept this new practice. It's only once a week. Graham felt a wave of nausea rise in his stomach. He had to get away from them, even if just for a moment. He forced a smile, nodded, and excused himself. I need to use the bathroom. As he stepped into the quiet of the bathroom, Graham splashed his face with cold water, trying to wash away the absurdity of it all. But his reflection stared back, his expression hard and unforgiving. My God, what nonsense, he thought, gripping the sink. She's asking me to accept her lover as part of our lives, as if this is all perfectly normal. Without thinking, he raised a fist, tempted to punch the mirror, to let out the fury that was boiling over. But he stopped just in time, steadying himself with a deep breath. No, he told himself, not yet. As he looked into his reflection, his resolve hardened. I can accept this, he thought, but I won't let them leave this. They think they can twist love and loyalty to suit their little game. Fine, but their karma will be coming right back at them. Before you find out about Graham's revenge, then subscribe to the channel now. In the bathroom, Graham stood with his hand rummaging through the medicine cabinet, feeling the pulse of his heartbeat still thrumming through him. He was searching for a bottle of anything to calm himself. But instead, his gaze kept landing on something else, a bottle of laxatives. His fingers brushed over the plastic container more than once, and an idea began to form, its wicked brilliance nearly making him laugh out loud. Instant karma, the phrase spun in his mind. He could picture Sharon and Stanley, talking about spiritual connections and energy, blissfully unaware of what lay ahead. Yes, he thought this would be the perfect payback for these enlightened souls. Graham slipped the bottle into his pocket, composing himself before heading back out. The plan crystallized in his mind, and he took a deep breath, putting on the mask of a man ready to make peace. Returning to the kitchen, Graham plastered on a warm smile. Of course, Sharon, this news has been a lot to take in, but you know I've always wanted you to be happy. If this path is what fulfills you, then I'll do my best to support you. Sharon's face softened, and her shoulders relaxed. Thank you, Graham. I knew you'd understand. Stanley, too, looked relieved, and Graham saw the briefest flicker of a smile. Excellent, Graham thought. It was working. How about we sit down, have some coffee, and just talk this out, he suggested, already moving toward the cupboard. Sharon nodded eagerly, and Stanley mumbled, that sounds good. Graham moved to the counter, putting on his best cooperative face. Great. I'll make us all some coffee, and we can sit down and talk this out, he said, watching Sharon and Stanley exchange a relieved look. This was all going smoothly, too smoothly, he thought with dark satisfaction. As he filled the cups, Graham's mind whirred. He needed a way to get them out of the room, just long enough to put his plan into action. That's when inspiration struck. But as he approached the table with the cups, he feigned a stumble, tilting one mug just enough to spill hot coffee across Stanley's lap. "Oh, I am so sorry," Graham exclaimed, putting on an apologetic face. "I didn't mean to. It's just, this news really threw me. You know? It's not every day that I meet my wife's spiritual partner," he added with a sheepish smile. Stanley jumped up, brushing at his soaked pants, his expression caught between annoyance and sympathy. It's okay, Graham. It's just really hot." "Oh, I feel terrible," Graham continued, his tone full of concern. "Why don't you go grab a pair of my sweatpants or something? You shouldn't have to sit around in those wet pants." He turned to Sharon, still apologetic. "Could you help him find something comfortable? They're in the top drawer of my closet." Sharon nodded, looking sympathetic as she guided Stanley down the hall. "Of course. We'll be right back." The second they left the room, Graham's expression changed, his jaw setting in steely determination. Swiftly, he poured fresh cups for Sharon and Stanley, then grabbed the laxative bottle from his pocket, shaking a generous dose into each cup. He stirred quickly, set the mugs back down, and resumed his place at the table, carefully masking his satisfaction. When Sharon and Stanley returned, Graham had himself seated, looking relaxed and a touch embarrassed. They took their seats, and as Sharon and Stanley took their first sips, Graham forced a sheepish smile. "Again, I'm so sorry, Stanley. Just nerves, I guess." Stanley shrugged, trying to keep things light. "Hey, it's okay." As they settled into small talk, Graham leaned back, keeping a close eye on them. Just wait, he thought to himself. He could already feel a glimmer of satisfaction beginning to crack through his frustration. "So, here's what I was thinking," Graham said, putting on his best cooperative tone. "I was planning on doing a barbecue today, but maybe, since we're all here, we could enjoy it together. Make this a sort of new start." Sharon's face lit up, and she grabbed Graham's hand with a warm smile. "That's a wonderful idea, honey. I think it's just what we need." Stanley looked hesitant, rubbing his stomach, and said, "I don't really eat meat. It's just, I try to stay on a plant-based diet." "No problem at all," Graham replied, keeping his voice calm. "We need to go to the store anyway. Let's all go and pick up some veggies, maybe even some vegetarian cutlets for you, Stanley." Graham gave him an encouraging nod. Sharon beamed. "That's so thoughtful, Graham. Thank you." Deep down, Graham held back a smirk, knowing what was about to unfold. He took another sip of coffee, watching the clock in his mind as they got up to head to the store. Soon, he thought. Very soon, the Real show begins. Graham stood up from the table and forced a smile. "I'll go get the car out of the garage while you two finish your coffee," he said, moving toward the door. Outside, he took a moment to gather himself, relishing the quiet satisfaction of his plan in motion. After a minute, he stepped back inside, putting on a worried look. "Sharon, I've got a flat tire," he lied, holding out his hand. "Can I take your keys instead? We'll use your car and I'll drive." "Of course," Sharon said, tossing him her keys without hesitation. Graham couldn't help but feel a smug satisfaction as he pocketed them. "No way am I putting my car at risk," he thought. "Besides, if things go as I hope, they might need a quick exit." Once everyone was settled in Sharon's car, with him at the wheel and the two of them in the back, Graham began the drive to the supermarket at a leisurely pace. He kept the conversation light, avoiding any talk of their earlier discussion, as he silently counted the minutes. 7 minutes in, he noticed Sharon shifting uncomfortably and Stanley fidgeting next to her. A faint smile played at Graham's lips. "Graham," Sharon finally said, her voice tense, "can you pick up the pace a bit? We should get there sooner rather than later." "Yeah," Stanley added, squirming. "Faster would be good." Graham nodded, stalling for a few more blocks as he watched them shift in discomfort. Another few minutes later, Sharon's tone grew sharp. Graham, come on, step on the goddamn gas pedal. Just then, a better idea hit Graham. A twist to his plan he hadn't seen coming. He pressed down on the gas, but then immediately eased off, looking at the dashboard with fake concern. Oh, something feels off, he muttered, glancing at them in the rearview mirror. Sharon leaned forward, exasperated. Forget the engine, Graham. We need to get to the store now. Just drive. If the engine seizes, we're stuck here, he replied, maintaining his charade. Graham pulled the car over, feigning frustration. Just a second, let me check under the hood. As he stepped out, he took the opportunity to press the central locking button, trapping them inside. After a few moments, he looked up, feigning surprise as he discovered that the doors were locked. Sharon was already yelling, knocking on the window. Graham, unlock it. Hurry up. He glanced back at her, pretending confusion. Hold on. I'm trying, he said, lifting the key fob as if pressing it over and over. Though in reality he did nothing. Why did you even lock it? Sharon shouted, her voice growing panicked. Just then, he fumbled the keys deliberately, dropping them by the curb. He bent over slowly, peering into the nearby storm drain and shaking his head in mock horror. Oh no, he called back to them. They fell straight into the drain. Sharon's eyes went wide as the realization hit her and Stanley looked on, his discomfort giving way to pure alarm. Graham straightened, holding his hands up helplessly, all while hiding the smirk threatening to break through. Stanley suddenly doubled over in the back seat, clutching his stomach as his face twisted in pain. Ugh! My stomach, he groaned, sweat starting to bead on his forehead. Sharon looked over, alarmed. What's wrong? She asked, but then she, too, felt a pang of discomfort that made her wince. Outside, Graham stifled a grin as he watched the two of them squirm. This was going even better than he'd planned. Graham, Sharon shouted, her voice rising in panic. Open these damn doors right now. Graham, feigning cluelessness, tilted his head like he didn't quite understand. What's the big rush? He called back, shrugging his shoulders with exaggerated innocence. We could just call roadside assistance, you know. Stanley's face was a shade paler as he doubled over, desperately clutching his middle. Graham, we don't have time for that. I need a bathroom. No. Oh, so it's a bathroom emergency, Graham replied, pretending to search the ground for a rock. Why didn't you say so? Here, let me just find something to break the glass with. He scanned around, taking his sweet time, all while stifling the snickers that kept bubbling up inside him. Sharon pounded on the window, frantic. Graham, we need out now. Sure thing, Sharon. He replied with a cheerful thumbs up. Let me just... Oh, you know, I think I read somewhere that calling 911 for a non-emergency is a great way to get fined. And we don't want that now, do we? Inside the car, Sharon and Stanley were in full-blown panic mode. Sharon's eyes darted around until she landed on the windshield. Stanley, just kick it out. We'll replace it later. Stanley nodded, his face scrunched in distress as he shifted his position, pressing his feet against the glass. He took a deep breath, clenched his teeth, and gave it everything he had, trying to kick the windshield out with one solid shove. Unfortunately, what came out first was something else entirely. The sound of a well, a rather awkward release escaped from Stanley, followed by an unmistakable spreading stain on his borrowed sweatpants. Graham, watching all of this unfold from outside, felt his cheeks flush with laughter he could barely hold in. Sharon looked at Stanley in horror, her mouth open. Stanley, oh no. Stanley's face was a mix of pure shock and shame, and he tried to cover himself with his hands, but the damage was done. He was stuck, sealed in with Graham's special, instant karma blend, in a way he could never have imagined. Before Sharon could even process what had happened, her own stomach cramped, and she grimaced, feeling the beginning of her own situation, going south. Oh no, Sharon muttered, her hands going to her midsection as she squirmed in place. But try as she might, the situation was beyond her control. Outside, Graham couldn't hold it in anymore. The sight of Stanley sitting there with his head hung low and a big brown spot on his pants, and Sharon looking horrified with her own unfortunate little incident, starting to spread, he burst out laughing. "Oh man," he managed to gasp out between breaths. Looks like you two really connected on a deeper level, huh?" Sharon and Stanley looked at him through the glass, their faces a mix of rage and utter humiliation. But they were in no position to argue, and Graham just stood there, doubling over in laughter as the two of them sat trapped in the car, caught in their own karmic nightmare. The cramps hit Sharon and Stanley again with full force, and they both doubled over, clutching their stomachs. Graham watched them, unable to resist a chuckle. "You two look like you're achieving a whole new level of spiritual connection," he said, crossing his arms and shaking his head in mock admiration. "Though I'd say the ladder to heaven probably isn't this fragrant." Inside the car, Sharon and Stanley were in full-blown panic, struggling to hold themselves together as liquid seeped from under them, creating a growing, unspeakable disaster. The smell was stifling, fetid, and suffocating. They pounded on the window again, desperately pleading. "Graham, please, for the love of all things holy, do something." Sharon shrieked, her face twisted in horror. Graham sighed, putting on a big show of thinking it over. "Well, I guess I can give you a little relief," he said, walking over to the driver's side window. By working together inside and out, they were able to lower the glass in the door by 1 inch. The second the window cracked open, a thick cloud of foul-smelling air whooshed out, hitting Graham square in the face. He jumped back, waving his hand in front of his nose. "Whoa, did I just open a portal to the underworld? I knew you guys were working on spiritual growth, but I didn't think it involved unleashing sulfuric fumes." From inside, Sharon and Stanley could only groan, their faces drained of any remaining dignity. The narrow gap offered only minimal ventilation, leaving them in their humid misery as Graham took a few steps back, stifling laughter as he watched the show unfold. Seeing that they were too far gone to climb out on their own, Graham pulled out his phone and dialed emergency services. "Hi, yes, I have a bit of an emergency here," he said, winking at the two trapped inside. "Yeah, there's a couple of people locked in a car and they're having a rather unfortunate gastrointestinal episode." As he hung up, Sharon leaned forward, glaring daggers through the barely opened window. "You did this, Graham. I know it was you." Graham raised his eyebrows in mock surprise. "Now, Sharon, that's quite an accusation. I didn't know yogic enlightenment included blaming others for karma." He shrugged, his smirk widening. "Seems to me this is just the universe sending a message. Maybe it's payback for a little, bad behavior." Stanley, utterly defeated, managed to whisper, "Graham, please." Graham shot him a pitying look. "You know, Stan, it's going to be hard to build a spiritual friendship with people who can't hold it together." He chuckled, holding his nose. "This is going to leave a lasting impression, let me tell you." And as they sat in a stifling car, suffocating in a haze of their own making, Graham watched, savoring every glorious karmic second. Inside the car, Sharon and Stanley had completely broken down. Sobbing and gasping for what little air was left, they clung to each other in abject misery. Outside, Graham tried to keep a straight face as flashing lights approached, sirens wailing. In minutes, the whole scene was swarming with first responders, police officers, paramedics, even a few firefighters. One of the officers walked over to Graham first, trying to keep his composure. "Sir, can you tell us what's going on here?" Graham nodded, adopting a somber expression. "It's a bit of a situation," he said, gesturing toward the car. "I got out and, well, the lock jammed, and the keys somehow fell right into that storm drain." He pointed to the grate with a helpless shrug. "And now, well, they're kind of, stuck." The police officer peered into the car and raised his eyebrows at the sight of Sharon and Stanley, both writhing in discomfort, their tear-streaked faces pressed against the windows. As the paramedics and firefighters took a closer look, a few snickers slipped out despite their best efforts to stay professional. One of the firefighters took a cautious step forward and muttered, "Guess it's time to break the glass and ventilate this situation before we lose one of them." He pulled out a tool to crack the window, but a paramedic beside him was already grimacing, covering his nose. With one good whack, the firefighter shattered a window. Instantly, a wave of nauseating air billowed out, forcing everyone to step back. One of the paramedics staggered, nearly retching. Good Lord, smells like, well, I'm not sure what's in there, but it's bad. Graham took a step back, waving his hand theatrically in front of his nose. I'd say they found an earthly way to experience rock bottom. He shot a grin at the responders, who were now laughing outright as they steeled themselves to pull Sharon and Stanley from the disaster zone. The firefighters and paramedics did their best, carefully lifting Sharon and Stanley out one by one. They gasped for fresh air, their faces etched with a mix of relief and utter humiliation as they took in their rescuers' poorly hidden smirks. Sharon and Stanley were finally pulled from the car, but the sight that met the first responders was beyond anything they could have expected. Both of them were covered in brown streaks of pure misery, their clothes soaked through with a foul-smelling sludge, and their faces streaked with dried tears and a touch of defeat. The responders exchanged glances, each trying to keep a straight face as they helped Sharon and Stanley toward the ambulance. One paramedic, unable to hold back his curiosity, raised an eyebrow and asked, "How the hell did you two get this? Dirty?" Stanley, his face ashen, opened his mouth to answer, but just closed it again, his eyes darting away in utter shame. Sharon's cheeks flushed as she fumbled with her shirt, trying in vain to cover the mess that had spread all over her. She looked at the paramedic with a pleading expression, but words failed her. The paramedic shook his head with a stifled chuckle, pulling out a sanitizing wipe from his pocket and handing it to her, even though one measly wipe wasn't going to make a dent in the mess. As they loaded Sharon and Stanley into the ambulance, the other responders exchanged smirks. Graham watched the whole scene with satisfaction, taking out his phone to call a taxi. Before climbing in, he flashed one last grin at Sharon and Stanley, who were now too exhausted and defeated to do anything but glare back. "I'd love to stick around," he said, his face full of faux sympathy, "but I need to go clear my head after all this." Once home, Graham calmly packed his things, breathing freely for the first time in ages. Closing his suitcase, he sat down with his laptop and started searching for the best divorce attorney in town. After all, he thought with a smile, this marriage was now far too dirty to clean up. That same evening, after the fiasco, Sharon tried calling Graham. She dialed his number repeatedly, her hands shaking, her heart torn between rage and humiliation. But each time, the call went unanswered, leaving her staring at her phone with a rising sense of dread. She sat there, memories of Graham's laughter echoing in her mind racing with thoughts of revenge and explanations she needed him to hear. The next day, after her disastrous spiritual experience with Stanley, Sharon returned home, still feeling the sting of shame that no amount of fresh air could wash away. Determined to confront Graham, she pulled up to the house, thinking of all the things she'd say, her arguments prepared and her story shaped. But when she opened the front door, she froze. The house was empty. Rooms were stripped bare of Graham's things, the closets emptied, and the drawers open, revealing nothing. Her heart dropped as she walked from room to room, slowly realizing what had happened. And then, on the kitchen counter, she spotted a single note in Graham's unmistakably neat handwriting. "Meet me in court." The words hit her like a punch, and she clutched the note, her stomach twisting.